Hello, everyone. For this section, we are talking to Lisa Raethke from Student Health Services, who will be providing information about things to think about when it comes to health and study abroad. Whenever you're ready, Lisa, take it away.
Hi, good morning. Um, so my name is Lisa Raethke. As Taylor said, I'm an RN here at Student Health Services. And today we're going to talk about a number of different things that relating to health and safety when you're abroad. The first thing that is probably the most common question that we get is about prescription medications. And you can travel with prescription medications. Things to think about are things like how does your prescription need to be stored? Does it need to be refrigerated? You can travel with a cooler on the plane if you need to, if you have a medication that needs to be kept cold. You can always contact your contact through Study Abroad if there's a question about medication, but most medications you can travel with. Some medications you need to have a written prescription from your doctor to travel with. And so it's always good if you have daily medicine to have a written copy of your prescription with you, just in case there's any question about it. There's always becomes the question, so you're going to be gone for 6 or 9 months, and you can get a 3-month supply of your prescription from your pharmacy before you go. And there's a few different ways that people handle prescriptions. Sometimes they will run 3 months through their insurance, and then they will use maybe one of the discount cards like Single Care or GoodRx to purchase an additional 3-month supply or 6-month supply from their pharmacy. If that's not possible, some people will have a parent or a friend have access to be able to fill that prescription 3 months down the road, and they will mail it to them in their site. Some people actually do establish care in the place where they're studying. That tends to be a little bit more difficult. You have to have usually records of your condition and your current treatment plan from your doctor with you. So, we encourage people to think about plans for medication before they go. Controlled medications do tend to be an issue. Things like Adderall, Vyvanse, things like that. And so it's very important to discuss that with your provider ahead of time. Sometimes those medications have been mailed to individuals. Sometimes records are obtained to establish care in the country that you're studying. And then another thing is for allergies, consider having a band with the language that is spoken in the country that you're in, translated, and consider wearing that on either like a dog tag style or a wrist bracelet style if you have severe allergies. Another thing to think about is birth control. We have some nice long-acting birth control methods, things like Nexplanon, Mirenas, or other IUDs. And so, think about those things before you go. And again, birth control pills, could be mailed. You could purchase extras prior to going. So think about that ahead of time. And then once you get to the country that you're studying, figure out where is a local clinic, where is a local hospital, where is a local pharmacy, kind of know your routes when you're there, so that if you did have an issue that arose, that you would know where to get care. And I'm going to be talking about this a little bit more, but, really encouraging you to have that visit with your physician, prior to leaving. The next thing we're going to talk about is about consent, sexual consent. And I think we all know, what consent means, but I think it's important to note that, consent can be conferred in other ways in other countries, and the only way to really confer consent is if both parties verbally express it. You know, in some countries, accepting drinks or gifts or things like that imply consent. And so it's important to know, you know, what your local customs are. And the other thing that I like to talk about here is just making sure when you are out and about that you are traveling in pairs and or groups, and you know, never leaving someone behind at a party or in a bar or a pub. That, you know, you really want to be out and about in pairs, come home in pairs, you know, make plans ahead of time, communicate with your friends, and then, you know, be sure that you're communicating very carefully with, you know, people that you might be engaging in relationships with when you are studying abroad. Let's watch a brief video now here about consent.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, you know, I'm not really sure. Then you can make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware that they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important bit, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you're entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say, "No thank you," then don't make them tea. At all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea, don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes please, that's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind, and you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they are unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea, and they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea, and they said yes, but in the time it took you to boil the kettle or brew the tea and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down, make sure the unconscious person is safe, and this is the important part again, don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they are safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week," or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you are able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea.
Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is about vaccines. And I'm going to interject here, one of the most important resources for you as you get ready to travel is the website cdc.gov. cdc.gov has a very excellent traveler resource. You can put in the country that you're going to be studying. You can see what health alerts are present in that country at this time. You can see what vaccines are required for entry, if there's any special medications that are encouraged, that's all in there. You can see if your country is a country that's at risk for things like malaria. There's charts. So I encourage you to take a look at cdc.gov. We do offer at Student Health Services a pre-travel physical. And one of the things that happens during that pre-travel physical is that an assessment of immunizations happen. And so the routine vaccines, of course, the hot one right now is COVID-19. So that's 2 doses of either Pfizer or Moderna vaccine are recommended for travel. Tetanus vaccine is a standard vaccine every 10 years. Measles and hepatitis B are common vaccines that generally you've had to have prior to entrance into school, and so you should have had those as a young child. But 2 measles vaccines and 3 hepatitis B vaccines are in that series. Chickenpox vaccine, if you either have a date of the actual disease, or if not, 2 doses of that vaccine. Pneumococcal vaccine, this is particularly for folks who are older than 50, really encouraged for those older than 65, or if you have some underlying lung conditions that might be encouraged. And then seasonal influenza vaccine is always recommended for travel. And just to remember that you know, we have seasonal influenza typically. We haven't seen much of it this year, but typically it's in the winter here in the United States. Just remember that seasonal influenza in the southern hemisphere is in the summer, is in what is considered our summer. Other specific travel vaccines, hepatitis A, so that's the food and waterborne hepatitis, so 2 shots, and that is sometimes part of standard vaccines now. Typhoid, very common vaccine recommended for any place that might not have you know, centralized drinking water. So any of your island nations, South America, Africa, places like that. And so that is a oral vaccine. It can be an injectable, but typically we give an oral vaccine, and that needs to be started at least 2 weeks prior to travel. Meningitis vaccine recommended specifically for some of our African countries. Rabies vaccine only recommended usually for folks who are really off the beaten path. You know, they're going to be studying in a cave, or they're going to be studying waterfall, you know, in very remote areas, and then that might be recommended. And then Japanese encephalitis and yellow fever, again, recommended for very specific parts of the world. Those 2 vaccines are not something that are really stocked locally. And so when we have people who need those vaccines, we often have to refer them to the vaccination clinic at the airport. They have a large travel clinic there. Again, I'm showing you a slide from the cdc.gov just to illustrate. This is a great guide for international travel for COVID-19. And so it indicates what needs to happen if you're fully vaccinated or not vaccinated. You know, you need to, if you're not vaccinated, you know, needing to get tested prior to traveling out of the US, and then mandatory test requirement before flying back in. Right now, both for vaccinated and fully vaccinated, that very likely might change. So I just am showing you this slide just so that you can be aware that this is another resource for you. Another thing we think about when we're traveling abroad is malaria. As I said, cdc.gov has a wonderful chart you can type in to see if the country that you'll be studying in is a country that has concern for malaria. And so just being aware if that is the issue in a country you're studying. Bug bite avoidance. Wearing clothing that covers exposed areas is important in these countries. Using nets, sometimes those nets are embedded with some sort of repellent, but some countries you might need a net. And then for some countries, there is medication, prophylactic preventive medication that is recommended. Those medications have to be started prior to travel and generally taken throughout the entire time that you're traveling. And if you are going to a country where malaria might be a risk, certainly thinking about that if you develop any fever during your travel or after your travel. Another issue that we talk about in our pre-travel physical time is about getting travelers diarrhea. And there's certainly things that you can do to prevent it. Think about, what foods that you are consuming. Certainly avoiding raw foods, boiling your water if you are not on a centralized, tested city water supply, boiling water, taking fruit, washing it, peeling it, that kind of thing. Most countries, bottled water is readily available, and we do encourage that. And then we also encourage people to bring over-the-counter medications, anti-diarrheal medications with them. And during our travel physical, we also give a prescription to treat diarrhea to have on hand, and that's an antibiotic, and that is something, to talk with your physician about before you leave. Just general thinking about health, what weather are you going to have? If you're in a very warm environment, thinking about fluid level and that kind of thing, making sure you stay hydrated, or if you're in a very cold climate, making sure that you're prepared, for layers and that kind of thing. Thinking about insects, if you're going to be out and about or in a rural area, bringing insect repellents with you. Experience than too much sun exposure, so being prepared for that with hats and some of the UV protectant clothing if you're in a very warm environment, and then certainly sunscreen. And then just being sensitive to a change in food and diet. Certainly introducing foods gradually over a period of time can be recommended. And then again, being careful of especially raw meat, raw eggs, things like that are not cooked, would be something to avoid. And then I like to show this slide at the end here. This is about piercings, and I'm going to also mention tattoos. It's fairly common for people to either get a piercing or a tattoo sometimes when they're studying. Just making sure if you do, the standards, depending on the country, may be as stringent as the United States, or they may be less stringent. And so making sure that the facility, check it out a little bit, the facility that you're going to use if you choose to do a piercing or a tattoo. And then watching for signs and symptoms of infection. If you see tenderness, drainage, redness that extends around that area, especially if it's, growing after the first 24 hours, being mindful of that and certainly seeking care if needed.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa, for all of that great information. If you have any questions regarding any of the information given in this presentation, please email studyabroad@uwstout.edu.